have better relations? And will the American foreign policy establishment allow this to happen? To CrossTalk Russia-U.S. Relations, I'm joined by my guest, Andrew Langer in Williamsburg. He is president of the Institute for Liberty, as well as host of Langercast on the Realm Network. And in Lake Jackson, we cross to Daniel McAdams. He is the executive director of the Ron Paul Institute for Peace and Prosperity. All right, gentlemen, crosstalk rules in effect. That means you can jump in anytime you want, and I very much appreciate it. Daniel, let me go to you first. We know Daniel that McAdams, he is the executive director of the Ron Paul Institute for Peace Vladimir Putin, and the Russian President. All right, gentlemen. They seem to be, at least, a week after the election, to be on the same page, moving in the same direction. What does it mean to have better relations? Because as we go through this program here, I have a very minimalist approach about what can be achieved. Go ahead, a week after
well, I think
the election, to be on this.
They had earlier this week sent absolute shockwaves through Washington. The Washington foreign policy establishment, Capitol Hill, they all believe that President-elect or candidate Trump was just lying or was just kind of smoothing things over when he said he wanted to get along with Putin. And I think when they had this call, which, as you say, it was a minimalist call. It wasn't a long chat. There were just a couple of things they covered. Very importantly, Syria was one of them that they covered in detail.
Hello and welcome to CrossTalk, where all things are considered. I'm Peter Lavelle. President-elect Donald Trump says he wants to improve relations with Russia. The Russian President Vladimir Putin tells us he agrees. What does it mean to have better relations? And will the American foreign policy considered? I'm Peter Lavelle. President-elect Donald Trump says he wants to improve relations with Russia. The Russian President Vladimir Putin tells us he agrees. What does it mean to have better relations? And will the American foreign policy establishment allow this to happen? To CrossTalk Russia-U.S. Relations, I'm joined by my guest, Andrew Langer in Williamsburg. He is president of the Institute for Liberty, as well as host of Langercast on the Realm Network. And in Lake Jackson, we cross to Daniel McAdams. He is the executive director of the Ron Paul Institute for Peace and Prosperity. All right, gentlemen, crosstalk rules in effect. That means you can jump in anytime you want, and I very much appreciate it. Daniel, let me go to you first. We know that the President Vladimir Putin tells us he agrees. What does it mean to have better relations? And will the American foreign policy establishment allow this to happen? To CrossTalk Russia-U.S. Relations, I'm joined by my guest, Andrew Langer in Williamsburg. He is president of the Institute for Liberty, as well as host of Langercast on the Realm Network. And in Lake Jackson, we cross to Daniel McAdams. He is the executive director of the Ron Paul Institute for Peace and Prosperity. All right, gentlemen, crosstalk rules in effect. That means you can jump in anytime you want, and I very much appreciate it. Daniel, let me go to you first. We know that the President-elect Donald Trump has spoken with Vladimir Putin, the Russian president, and they seem to be, at least, a week after the election, to be on the same page, moving in the same direction. What does it mean to have better relations? Because as we go through this program here, I have a very minimalist approach about what can be achieved. Go ahead, Daniel.
Well, I think that the telephone call that they had earlier this week sent absolute shockwaves through Washington. The Washington foreign policy establishment, Capitol Hill, they all believe that President-elect or candidate Trump was just lying or was just kind of smoothing things over when he said he wanted to get along with Putin. And I think when they had this call, which, as you say, it was a minimalist call. It wasn't a long chat. There were just a couple of things they covered. Very importantly, Syria was one of them that they covered in detail. It's extremely important. It was just a day or so later that some usual suspect senators had an absolute panic attack.
John McCain.
The president-elect.
John McCain.
Yes, John McCain. Exactly. And they literally warned the president-elect not to do this, setting the stage for a colossal clash of the titans in Washington.
You know, Andrew, one of the biggest problems that I see with the American foreign policy establishment is that they have no interest in what Russia's interests are. That's one of the huge problems we have right now. It's really quite phenomenal. You know, they don't even take for a second to stand in Vladimir Putin's shoes and look west. They just cannot conceive of that. And that's why I have a very minimalist agenda. And I'll spill the beans right now. I would like to see a relationship where the two countries are not on the verge of going to war. If we can get to there, I'll be happy. Go ahead, Andrew.
Well, I think you're right in that regard. It was one of the great ironies of the 2016 election cycle that Hillary Clinton was lined up with a great many of D.C.'s hawks in the defense establishment. There was a piece in foreign policy a few weeks before the election by one of Hillary Clinton's advisors, happens to be a classmate of mine from William and Mary, calling for this very aggressive no-fly zone in Syria. When you're calling for a no-fly zone, you're saying that you are ready to shoot down somebody else's military jets. And we're not talking about the Iraqi Air Force or the Iranian Air Force even. We're talking about the Russian Air Force. I will disagree with you in terms of the fact that I don't necessarily want a minimalist foreign policy. I do think we need active engagement with the Russians on a whole host of levels. But we do need to be cooperative where we can be cooperative. In solving the crisis in Syria, we can be cooperative with them without threatening to shoot down their warplanes. But in places like Central Europe, in places like Ukraine and the Crimea, we actually have to start working with them to try to find solutions to these problems so that you have countries all throughout Central Europe not feeling like they're under threat. Now, that's not to say that we deploy troops, but we do need to work in a cooperative, respectful approach. I think part of that does come with understanding that Russia does have interests of their own and recognizing them. And I think Donald Trump may actually be one of those people who can do that.
Okay, you know, that's interesting. I think I was misunderstood here. Is that I don't want to have a minimalist agenda. I expect one. Okay, I would like to see much more. Okay, but Daniel, I mean, this is one of the problems here. Is that you know, if we look at the original reset, Michael McFaul. He got it all wrong. He said, let's work on little things and ignore the major things. I don't even know if the Russians are interested in what's called the reset. I mean, it was so badly conceived and badly executed. And the Russian side, our viewers must know, are disappointed. They were disappointed. What do the Americans really want? Oh, well, we just had a regime change in Ukraine after the reset. That's not the reset in the minds of Russians here. So, you know, I think what's really important is that the Americans have to admit they have to talk to the Russians about what the two countries disagree on very strongly. And you have to start there, and you have to deploy something America has forgot. It's called diplomacy. Go ahead, Daniel.
Well, Peter, I think there is a huge danger because what's happened in Washington, it's become an echo chamber. They believe all of their own propaganda. And if you look at newspapers like the Washington Post, they're actually absolutely seething against Russia. Conspiracy theories, up and down. So the problem is you have an absence of objective information. Yeah. And I know it might shock some of your viewers, but members of Congress and senators are not well-informed people. They read the Washington Post. They talk to their staffers who read the Washington Post. So when you have someone coming along like Trump saying we need better relations with Russia, all they've been spoon-fed for years is that Putin is the new Hitler. So it's going to be enormously difficult to break through this propaganda cycle. And all of the experts in Washington, so-called experts, they all buy into this. So he's literally up against the entire establishment.
Daniel,
if this
Peter,
is the route he's going.
For a second, because
go ahead, jump in. Go ahead, Andrew. Go ahead.
One of the great problems that we're seeing, and this is something you and I have talked about in the past, Peter, is the issue of, when the Soviet Union disappeared in the early 90s, many of the Sovietologists at the time, who had been studying Russia for years, they gave up on the study of Russia and they went elsewhere. You and I had talked about a professor that you knew who started studying Arabic, desperately learning Arabic. A professor of mine, my mentor in my Soviet studies program, now teaching general political science. And when you combine that with the fact that you have people who haven't been studying Russia, most of these congressional staffers are in their 20s. They simply don't know about Russian history, about the history of the relationship between Russia and America. And you create this, there's an echo chamber, there's a real knowledge gap. where folks really don't understand what is happening on the ground. In fact, I would dare say what we're facing right now is a very similar crisis to the one that we faced 15, 20 years ago when there was a gap in understanding of what was happening in the Middle East. And so you had a bunch of folks who were desperately trying to get up to speed on Arabic studies, Middle Eastern studies. We're now going to face that crisis. Here we are. I think we ought to be calling folks who are experts on Russia and Russian policy back into the fold to start speaking out again.
You know, Daniel, I saw the White House briefing with John Kirby. Well, he's such an imbecile, an ignorant imbecile. How dare he treat the press that way? And the reason why I mention that is because, like you said, you have the media and you have the powers that be in lockstep here. I mean, empirical evidence doesn't work with them. Facts don't work with them. All we get is prejudice. And that's why I go back to this minimalist agenda. Getting past that, getting through that is going to be very, very difficult, if not impossible. Go ahead.
You know, the way Kirby treated the RT reporter was just absolutely reprehensible. And kudos to Matt Lee, who is a real journalist, for being a gentleman, for standing up and saying, this is just a journalist trying to do her job. Would they do this to the BBC, to RFE, to Voice of America? No, absolutely horrible. And I think he's actually suffered a little bit of consequences for this. But you know, there is a danger. Anyone speaking outside the rules in Washington is in trouble. And you know, it was really hilarious to me, Peter. As soon as the ink was dry on the election results, the neocons turned on a dime in Washington. Oh my God, Hillary didn't win. You had people like Max Boot writing something the next day. You know, oh, Trump might not be so bad. And you had Elliot Cohen, who had been the never Trumper for so long. He thought he was going to waltz in there and get a top job, and he couldn't believe when they told him to get out. But the danger is there because these so-called experts in Washington, they're all neocons. The Heritage Foundation is extremely busy trying to ramp up Trump's State Department. They want to put their people in all the little positions.
Infiltrate.
And I've been through one transition where I saw this happen. Yes, I've seen this happen. I saw Rumsfeld and the others pour over.
Hang on here, Andrew. I was just going to say, these type of people give prostitution a bad name. Go ahead, Andrew.
Well, I will tell you something. You know, one of the most disturbing potential appointments that's come out of this isn't John Bolton, it isn't Rudy Giuliani, but the fact that a guy named Frank Gaffney is in the inner circle there at the White House with this transition. Frank Gaffney is a hawk. He is an Islamophobe. He has worked tirelessly to trash the reputations of very good conservative Republicans who happen to either A, be Muslim, or B, have Muslim-sounding names. You know, the irony was, you know, that you had Frank Gaffney go after a guy named David Safavian. Now, it turned out David Safavian got caught up in the whole Jack Abramoff scandal. But Gaffney went after him because there was a belief that he was a closeted Muslim as opposed to an Armenian Russian Orthodox or Greek Eastern Orthodox. I mean, there is a real danger in that regard. And I've been really thinking a great deal about this issue of who the real diplomats are, who they can put up there, who are not going to be either clones of John McCain or clones of Hillary Clinton.
For Secretary of State. I've said it before. Okay, Daniel, go ahead. Go react to that. You know him very well. Okay, or you need Pat Buchanan. Okay, bring him back. Go ahead, Daniel. Before we go to the break, 30 seconds. Go ahead. Before we go to the break.
I would just say that there is a very big danger in Washington because it is where groupthink is as most healthy. People don't think outside the box. If you are a Republican or conservative, you've got to be an interventionist. You've got to find enemies abroad because you're funded in your think tanks by the military-industrial complex. You don't dare bite the hand that feeds you. So the entire system is corrupt. The entire system is messed up. And it makes me a little bit pessimistic that Trump will be able to reach outside of that.
Okay, gentlemen, I'm going to jump in here. We're going to go to a short break, and after that short break, we'll continue our discussion on Russia-U.S. relations. Stay with RT. Andrew, let me go back to you in Williamsburg. Really to explain to our viewers the kind of difficulty Donald Trump faces vis-a-vis Russia policy is that engaging Russia is deemed to be appeasement. So we can't even have a diplomatic arrangement here. Engagement is equivalent to appeasement. Now, this is what they have done to themselves. Washington has done to themselves. And this is what Washington has done to the Europeans as well. This is the real dilemma. Go ahead, Andrew.
Well, it's interesting because I actually want to sort of shift gears a little bit and talk about one of the most telling things about how Mr. Trump might handle his foreign policy, and why this approach that he's taken is an interesting one. So, over the campaign trail, he was talking about East Asia and East Asia politics, and specifically America's commitment to protecting Japan, and he made some inflammatory statements. What happens is he gets elected. Who's one of the first leaders to call him? Prime Minister Abe from Japan, who is coming to the United States today to meet with him. Prime Minister Abe from Japan. And so you see that there is this interesting way of negotiating, of trying to find a way to bring people together. Now, you're right. There's a tough balance that's going to be here. But there's the line from Star Trek VI. Spock says to Kirk, there's an old Vulcan proverb, only Nixon could go to China. We may be saying that it might have to have taken a leader like Donald Trump to go and sit down with Vladimir Putin. And remember, you're absolutely right. It's such a complex series of issues because the situation in Ukraine and in Central Europe is not the same as the situation in Syria. Two very different sets of circumstances requiring two very different approaches. But we have to have this conversation. We have to have it. Russia's going to want to start talking about trade once again, reopening trade, and finding a way to find some solutions to these very thorny problems that the U.S. has been, frankly, content to ignore for a very long time.
I absolutely agree. Daniel, the situation in Ukraine could be resolved very easily if there was goodwill. Make the regime there honor the Minsk Accords, okay? With Syria, Donald Trump is spot on, at least in one way, is that let's take care of the proxy terrorist war there first. And then you can move on. See, this is what I'm afraid of, Daniel, or what I worry about, is that if you any kind of solution, you have to give the Russians credit. They don't want to do that. They have a foreign policy that is a hammer, and all they see around the world are nails. Go ahead.
That's the difficulty, really, and that's why I often mourn my career choice, because the difficulty of being a foreign affairs professional is that you have to always want to push for more. And the idea, the solution to the problems between the U.S. and Russia, for the most part, would be for the U.S. to do less, to not put troops on Russia border, to bring them back, to not get involved in Ukraine, don't arm either side, don't arm anyone, pull back from Syria. The Russians and the Syrians are doing quite a good job on their own dealing with Aleppo. Don't try to do more. Don't try to remake the country. Pull out of Afghanistan. So the solution for better relations is for the United States to do a lot less. And nobody likes that because there's no money in that.
There's no money, and there's, Andrew, if I can go to you, there's no prestige in it either. I mean, it's part of the genetic code of American foreign policy to be everywhere, to stick your fingers in your nose everywhere, in places where there are very little American interests, security interests. Go ahead.
As my mentor is fond of saying to me, it's this issue of don't just stand there, do something. I will say this much, though. In those areas in which the U.S., the Russians, and the Syrian government have cooperated to get aid to those in need, that's worked extraordinarily well. And taking those cooperative approaches works very well. I mean, listen, I disagree with Daniel on the issue. I'm not someone who's interested in foreign adventurism. But I do think having an activist role on the world stage is a good thing, not if you are sort of promoting warfare. But on the other hand, to be able to work in a conciliatory way, in a cooperative way with people, we have to do that. And obviously, I know Daniel and I will agree on this. The best way you work with people is to trade with them. It's been a mainstay of libertarian philosophy for decades that you don't go to war with people that you're engaged in active trade with. So the more people we're trading with, the fewer of these conflicts will arise. That's what we need to be doing. We need to be focusing on more of that.
That's a very good point, Daniel. And Trump is a businessman. He thinks in terms of deals, and that may, I'm interested in new approaches. That this dead end that is in Washington right now, where there is no differences in ideology. Either you're with them, with the people in power, or you're traitors. I mean, again, the discourse is completely collapsed. You can't have a decent conversation with these people.
And look where diplomacy has been tried. It's actually working out very well. And ironically, these are every one of Obama's successes were vehemently opposed by the neocons. Look at the Iran deal. Despite what Trump has said in the past, the Iran deal is actually working pretty well. Trade is opening up. Trade is starting. And guess what? Iran is not invading every country around it. They're not sponsoring terrorism. It works well. The same thing with Cuba. It works very well. Two things the neocons hated. So the idea that that we can do these things, that we can continue to trade, to start to trade again with Russia, would start producing results very, very quickly.
Oh, it's very interesting because, Andrew, that's how the Russian side sees this also, is that there are these needless irritants in the relationship that don't need to be there at all. Like I said, Ukraine can be easily taken care of. But now you have their NATO underlings. They want to keep Russia as an enemy, and they're terrified that the United States would change its position here. And that actually talks about the future of NATO, which, Trump is saying, pay your own way. I mean, what's so radically weird and traitorous about that? Go ahead.
Well, I mean, there is a great fear. Listen, here's the grand irony, right? I mean, to me, it's ironic that as Donald Trump is talking about these things, you have Democrats and major Democrats who have pushed back very hard against this. Folks who have never been, some of them have been interventionists, certainly, but they've never been considered hawks. But nevertheless, because it's Donald Trump who's saying it, they're pushing back wholly. And that's a very, very strange set of circumstances. But the reality is, these alliances are meant to change over time. They were never meant to be permanent. And the idea that we are sort of beholden simply because it's the way that we've done things is not the way to look at it. Certainly, we want to make sure that things are going to remain stable. That's the great fear amongst most folks that when I talk to them about their fears of a Donald Trump presidency is that more instability will be created. So we have to find ways to work cooperatively so that those fears of instability are assuaged.
Daniel, it seems to me that the Washington clan just doesn't know anything about history, because for all of history, you have had great powers that have different interests, and they're competitors. And sometimes they disagree. Sometimes they go to war. But, accept that there are differences. Russia sees the world differently than the United States. Wow, is that a surprise? No, it has its own interests. And these interests do not have to clash. Like I said, my minimalist hope is that to avoid conflict, and then we work from there. Go ahead, Daniel.
Well, what's been interesting is that Congress has really been in a coma for at least the past 8 years. I would say since 2002, when they passed the authorization for Iraq, they all just went to sleep. So they've completely ignored their constitutional obligations and duties as an equal, actually the first branch of government. And all they can do is issue harsh words and pass sanctions. As a matter of fact, just this week, the House passed yet a new sanctions bill on Syria, targeting Iran and Russia. So they're not getting the memo. Ben Cardin, the senator from Maryland, he is putting up legislation to investigate the Russians for hacking the elections. They are not getting the message. But what I wonder, what I'm fascinated to see is what will happen. Will there be a colossal clash between Trump's foreign policy, and the president actually does have a significant amount of legitimate constitutional authority in foreign affairs? Will he clash with the McCains of the Senate? And what will happen at that point? It's going to be very difficult. Does Trump start to appeal to his people in the streets, the people that voted really for a political revolution? You could see a lot of pressure being put on Congress if he takes it to the people, if McCain and Lindsey Graham and the others keep with the war talk, and he takes it to the people. It could get actually quite interesting.
It's really interesting, Andrew, is that, we saw that the Republican Party didn't line up behind him while he was running. He wins anyway because of the popular will. it looks like he could face the same kind of resistance by the party establishment. And he is technically head of the party right now. The Republicans have a remarkable opportunity right now. I just have to wonder if they're going to squander it like the Democrats squandered their position. Go ahead, Andrew.
Well, listen, I have all sorts of faith in the capacity of Republicans to squander public goodwill. but the reality is, and it gets back to Daniel's central point, which is the president is cloaked in enormous power in terms of dealing with these issues. See, to me, I think in the end, the proof is going to be in the pudding. Right? You had Barack Obama elected in 2008, all this great hope in Europe that he was going to make massive change, that he was going to restore the image of America. And he messed it up. I mean, over the course of 8 years, just failure after failure after failure. The reality is, when you see people like Prime Minister Shinzo Abe coming to America to meet with Donald Trump early on to get that relationship going, and my prediction is that as a result of this meeting, then we're going to look at a multilateral trade agreement specifically between Japan and the United States, as opposed to this behemoth of a Trans-Pacific partnership. That we're going to see more instances like that. And so the proof will be out there. The American public, yes, they're going to pay attention to things like the TPP fight and how that goes, and they'll pay attention to sort of military operations if they wind up happening and going anywhere.
Okay, gentlemen, I got to jump in here. Gentlemen, we've run out of time. Fascinating discussion. Many thanks to my guests in Williamsburg and Lake Jackson. And thanks to our viewers for watching us here at RT. See you next time. And remember, crosstalk rules.